what I would try and do is look at what people tried to do or have tried to do about some of these things at the different moments they appeared. Dave asked me to speak about GM, synthetic biology, and a bit about geoengineering. And so I'm going to try and address some of what the public, even when they're as limited as they have been in these discussions, actually comes up with. So in some ways it's quite impressive. Now the GM debate started off really in 1996-7. I don't know how many people were involved in it. It was remarkable the way the public and NGOs, they responded by informing themselves. People who knew nothing about the science and the politics of it informed themselves very deeply in many cases of the issues. But they also took action. I mean, the action aspect of it was amazing. The GM crop trials gave people an opportunity to act locally, and they did so. And what I found really impressive also was that there was covert action, which was absolutely essential, where people simply disappeared and never said anything. And there was open action where people did assume responsibility for stuff. And in those days, very largely, people managed to live with each other from those two sides, which is quite a sort of responsible and remarkable reaction, really. There were a few times when it got difficult, but most of the time it didn't. So people, also there were many judicial processes that people were involved in, many trials where people responded and reacted. And basically we did have a de facto moratorium in the EU on GM crops for several years. Unfortunately, the WTO process meant that we had to develop laws, and as everybody knows, laws are not necessarily very helpful, and in this respect they allowed GM in. Basically, there was this irrational moratorium, as we were always told, and that kept them out, and laws let them in, so that's an interesting reflection, I think. The problems are really clear now with GM, and yet we have this huge backlash now with industry working with government to bring GM in, and I'm not even sure of the position of the Labour Party on this, I must say. We did have a GM Nation debate, and it was quite interesting what the public thought. They were really distrustful. The more they engaged with GM, the more sceptical they got, which was the opposite of what the experts used to say. The other thing was that they distrusted government and multinational companies profoundly, and that continues in the synthetic biology debate as well. They wanted to know more and understand things, but they also distrusted the process of GM Nation. Even though GM Nation, I noticed that you didn't think much of it, but actually it did have aspects which were quite good, where people were self-organised, organised by councils and people and groups to some extent. So although it was not perfect, it was one of the best things we've had. There was money put into it by the government. Various people I worked with worked very hard on framing it. And there was real discussion and real anger and real argument and so forth, which was a good thing. Now, I then worked on the UK dialogue on synthetic biology, which was much more managed. That was 2009-10. And lots of people, what was interesting there was the first debate was self-selected. People came along because they were interested. The second debate, they made a huge effort to keep out people, even people who had anything to do with Friends of the Earth or anything like that, any kind of involvement in anything. Had a huge fight, because I was part of the oversight group, God help me. We had a huge fight over per person selection and so forth. Scientists were involved. The scientists told all kind of extraordinary porkies and had to be picked up on that. We had to work very hard on framing the dialogue, on the materials and everything else. They wanted to start off by asking everybody what benefits they'd had from technology in their lives. I mean, talk about that as a neutral beginning to a debate. So we had to kick that one out. But the public in the end was very good. They asked 5 questions. They might sound pretty anodyne, but what's the purpose? Why do you want to do it? What are you going to gain from it? What else is it going to do? And how do you know you're right? Very simple questions. But then they also asked, why are you doing this research? How's your research shaped your relationship to society and the world? Who is really driving this process? Who are the winners and the losers? Do scientists need a bit of help to understand the potential impacts of their research, perhaps? What are health and environmental impacts of these applications? And we don't like the lack of transparency concerning emerging problems with these technologies. So people were very perceptive on that. And they wanted their approach and their attitudes to be embedded in the cultures and practices of research, which I thought was interesting, and would like to challenge the BBSRC on that, for example. But anyway, so with geoengineering, everything changed in a way, because as somebody said earlier, with geoengineering, the idea is we face a catastrophe, so anything goes. When you've got a catastrophe, you can take highly risky measures, and sulfates in the stratosphere, mirrors in space. I like the one about cropped plants that reflect the light, genetically modified crop plants that have a nice albedo and send the light back. Saltwater seeding of clouds, fertilizing the seas with iron filings, grinding up billions of tons of carbonate and putting it in the sea to counter acidification. So it's just more of the same stuff. But people feel very justified. They want to save the planet. We've got so many scientists now around the place who want to save the planet. It just makes you quite sick. There's an absolute stampede. And the point is that the systems, the planetary systems are so complex we don't understand them. Our models are totally irrelevant, really. And there just hasn't been a debate in geoengineering. There was one, which I didn't know anything about until afterwards, organised by the Natural Environment Research Council, and it was totally manipulated as far as I can tell. And all the issues were very anodyne, so they just responded within the context that they were given and nothing more. So it was like, potential for fair regulation. Controllability, reversibility, effectiveness in terms of costs and benefits, timeliness, all those things. They said all these must be responded to, but this is with the assumption that it will go ahead. And there wasn't really any discussion of the engineering mindset of the so-called Anthropocene either. So, just some conclusions, but we've said quite a lot of this already. This engineering mindset emerges all the time. And we got a sort of attitude to science that is about intervention all the time, rather than observation and understanding. At a recent meeting on synthetic biology, 2 experts claimed that the public was happy to allow the experts to go ahead, that they were perfectly happy to let them get on with it. And it's so obvious that this is just not the case, but this is what they're putting around now. And of course, as Himmler knew very well, you repeat the same lie over and over again and people start to believe it, and they get tired and they get fed up and they've got other things to do. So people do distrust the experts. But the trouble is that scientists are behaving very badly too. This whole idea of uncertainty built into physics, if not into anywhere else, is being abandoned. And I can't help thinking that it's government and public relations and industry. They want certainty. That's what they're about. When you're planning, you want certainty. But, the uncertainties of science are very uncomfortable now, even to scientists. And as for the principle of precaution, using precaution in your approach to that, the number of attacks that are being made on the principle of precaution, not doing something if you really suspect that there may be a problem or don't know enough about it to be sure or whatever, this is being deeply trashed and continuously so. So I think that I wanted to ask also, just one quick thing on the Convention on Biological Diversity, which I've worked with for a long time. That has tried to get some international positions on these things, and work of key government and NGOs on those 3 issues, genetic engineering, but particularly synthetic biology and geoengineering. International decisions, at least trying to delay deployment, just to slow this thing down so that we have some time to think on it. But now the whole idea of moratoria on technology is being deeply attacked by the techno-fix experts. And just one issue that's been raised by the etc. group and others, and also by ourselves. Are we serious about assessing new technologies, and what capacity do we really have to assess a new technology before it's deployed? Is that the way forward? But it's very interesting to try and think how one can do that. Could we assess it before we deploy it and decide not to deploy it? So, in that sense, are we prepared to apply the principle of precaution rigorously? Because that's what that would involve, a real principle of precaution. And are we prepared to look at ourselves as human beings, as our propensity for gossip and addiction and all the rest of it, that all our personal qualities are we prepared to look at those and look at technologies in the light of those? So just a few thoughts.